Sometimes I feel like I was born to fill the empty spaces in other people's lives. I was the person everyone looked to when there wasn't enough money, patience, or strength, as if my existence had been predetermined for one sole purpose: to save them from themselves. My name is Lucinda, and I can't quite remember when I first realized that I was different from my sister, Sarah. Maybe it was when I was 7 and she was 4. I watched her play with dolls, carefully arranging them in a circle, while I stood by the kitchen stove, helping Mom cook dinner. Or maybe that feeling had always been with me, surrounding me like an invisible layer of air that you only notice when it becomes too heavy. Those days when I looked out of the kitchen window, watching children play outside while I washed dishes I could barely reach, seemed to whisper to me, "You're not like them." "Lucinda, is your homework done?" Mom would ask every day after school in her sharp, tense voice, heavy with expectation. "Yes, Mom," I'd answer automatically, as if the words were already programmed into me. My small hands deftly tied 2 oversized aprons gifted to me on my 6th birthday. A practical gift, Mom had said, placing them on my lap with a proud look, as if she were giving me the key to a new world. From that day on, I wrapped myself in those aprons daily, helping to cook as if it were my inevitable role in the family. "Sarah, sweetheart, you can go play," Mom would add, her voice softening, as if for Sarah there existed a different dimension where responsibilities turned into games. Sarah would skip off, disappearing into her world of dollhouses and crayons, while I tiptoed to reach the high counter. I knew better than to complain. "She's still little," Mom reminded me every time I dared to voice my frustration. "You're the older sister, you need to help." Dad wasn't any different. He'd come home from work in the evenings, warm and smiling, to ruffle Sarah's hair. She'd show him her drawings, always bright and haphazard, made between bursts of homework, and he'd praise her, even when the scribbles made little sense. Then he'd turn to me. "So, how are your grades today, Lucinda?" Not, "How was your day?" Not, "What did you learn?" Just, "Grades." The answer was always the same. I'd stand up straight, smile, even when all I wanted inside was to scream, "Why don't you ever ask how I feel?" Our house was small, 2 stories, cozy in its modest simplicity. It felt like a stage set, where every object spoke of order, discipline, and each person's role in the family. My friends lived nearby, but I rarely saw them. My days were consumed by washing dishes, doing laundry, helping Sarah with her homework, even though she often preferred to turn her textbooks into paper airplanes. There's one day I remember particularly clearly. I was 10 and had just won first place in a regional math competition. My teacher looked at me with admiration as she spoke to my parents. "You've done a wonderful job raising Lucinda. Her love of learning is extraordinary." Mom nodded, proudly placing a hand on my shoulder. "Well, we've always encouraged her to read," she said, as if those words explained everything. I stood there, smiling, but inside I wanted to scream, tell her the truth. That the only encouragement I ever got was the disappointment in your eyes if I brought home anything less than perfection. But I simply nodded. Because it was my duty to be the good daughter. Meanwhile, Sarah, oblivious to the conversation, was folding her failed math test into paper airplanes. No one even mentioned it. It was as if it didn't matter. Sometimes I caught her looking at me. Sarah would glance at me with a faint smirk, especially in those moments when she managed to dodge yet another responsibility. Her smug expression seemed to say, "Well, big sister, are you keeping up?" "You're just jealous," Sarah once said when I was 12 and she was 9. I remember standing in our shared bathroom, wiping streaks off the mirror, still damp from scrubbing the sink. Sarah, in her bright pajamas, stood behind me, her reflection in the mirror wearing that same infuriating smirk. "Because Mom and Dad love me more," she added, rocking slightly on her heels. "That's not true," I replied, but even then, deep down, I couldn't help but wonder, maybe she was right? By the time Sarah entered middle school, I had already become her personal tutor. It wasn't my choice, but our parents made it clear that it was my responsibility to help my little sister. Every day after school, I'd sit with her at the kitchen table, trying to explain the basics of algebra. She'd half listen, mostly distracted by her phone under the table, tapping out messages to her friends. "Sarah, you need to pay attention," I'd say, already drained from my own school day and endless chores. "Why?" "You'll just end up doing it for me anyway," she'd reply with that same irritating smirk. And she was right. That's exactly how it always ended. "Lucinda, why isn't Sarah's homework done yet?" Mom would inevitably ask, hands on her hips. "She's not focused," I'd try to explain. "Then make her focus. You're supposed to help." And so, I ended up doing her assignments myself. Meanwhile, Sarah would watch YouTube videos or doodle something in her notebook. I knew it was easier to do everything myself than to endure Mom's disappointed tone. Sarah's weekly allowance came like clockwork, $20 every Friday, which she would promptly spend on something fashionable or order food. As for me, if I got $5 a month, it always came with a lecture about how money doesn't grow on trees. The turning point came when I turned 16. I could no longer bear watching Sarah proudly flaunt her new clothes or the latest gadgets while I wore hand-me-downs and sometimes couldn't even afford lunch at school. For the first time, I felt like I had to do something for myself. One day, as I walked past Joe's cafe on the next street over, I noticed a "Help Wanted" sign in the window. Joe, the owner, was a gruff man with kind eyes who had treated me to more than a few hot chocolates over the years. Summoning my courage, I stepped inside. "Think you can handle it?" he asked, eyeing me as though doubting my ability. "Of course I can," I replied, though inside I was trembling. The job was hard, waiting tables, mopping up spilled drinks, smiling at irritable customers. But it was mine. For the first time in my life, I was earning my own money. My first paycheck, $8.50 for a month of part-time work, felt like freedom compressed into the palm of my hand. I got carried away by the moment. I left the check on the kitchen counter and went upstairs, not even considering that this might end badly. "Lucinda." Mom's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Come down here." When I walked into the kitchen, Mom and Dad were already seated at the table, the check lying between them. Dad looked stern, and Mom's face bore the all-too-familiar expression of disappointment. "Why didn't you tell us you were working?" Dad asked sternly. "I just got paid," I stammered. "Well, since you live under our roof and eat our food, you'll give us half of it," Mom declared. "That's only fair." The worst part wasn't even that. A week later, Sarah walked into our shared room wearing brand new Nike sneakers. "Look what Mom and Dad bought me with your money," she said, spinning around in delight. I couldn't believe my ears. My money. The money I had earned. She smiled as though it were some kind of joke. That night, I locked myself in the bathroom and cried for a long time. But it was also the moment I made a decision. I would get out of here. College would be my ticket to freedom. I knew my parents would never help me pay for school. Every time the subject of money came up, Mom would say, "Sarah needs money for college." But I was no longer going to rely on their decisions. With newfound determination, I threw myself into my studies, making them my sole focus. I started staying at school longer and longer. The time I spent in the library at the computers became my refuge. I researched scholarships, looked up free tuition programs, anything that could pull me out of this endless cycle. Every spare minute was spent preparing for the SAT, writing essays, and maintaining my perfect GPA. I knew that if I missed even one opportunity, there might not be another. Graduation day was exactly what I had expected, another performance of The Perfect Family, with my parents playing the starring roles. I sat in my blue cap and gown, listening as Principal Roberts announced loudly, Lucinda Matthews, the valedictorian of this year's graduating class. He praised my accomplishments, speaking words that felt hollow to me. The Matthews have done an exceptional job raising Lucinda, he told the crowd. Her academic success is truly remarkable. Mom theatrically dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while Dad stood tall, chest puffed with pride. I watched them from a distance, seeing how they nodded and smiled, accepting congratulations from other parents. None of them knew that by that point, I had already received acceptance letters from every college I had applied to. I had been checking the mailbox for weeks, intercepting the letters before anyone else could see them. Each acceptance was like a key to a door I had been trying to open my entire life. Among them was one that stood out. Riverside University had offered me a full scholarship, free housing, and even a small stipend for personal expenses. The university was 4 hours away in a neighboring state, far enough for me to gain my freedom but still close enough to visit home if I ever wanted to. I didn't tell anyone, waiting for the right moment. That moment came during the dinner Mom had arranged to celebrate my graduation. She cooked pasta, which she assumed was my favorite, though she had never actually asked me what I truly liked. Lucinda, she began with a smile, serving herself a second helping. Have you thought about what you'll do now, after graduation? I opened my mouth to tell them about Riverside, but before I could say a word, she continued. I spoke to Joe yesterday at the cafe. He said he'd be happy to take you on full-time. Wouldn't that be wonderful? You could earn more and help out with family expenses. I took a deep breath. I've been accepted into college, I said, feeling the strange tension my words brought into the room. A full scholarship to Riverside State. I start in the fall. A deafening silence fell over the room. Mom's fork slipped from her hand, clattering loudly against her plate. Dad's face turned an alarming shade of red. College? In another state? Mom's voice came out sharp. What about your family? What about helping Sarah? I've been helping Sarah my whole life, I replied quietly but firmly. This is something I need to do for myself. Dad stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. He didn't say a word but slammed the door as he left the room. Look at what you've done, Mom hissed, her face filled with disappointment. Sarah sat at the table with a faint smirk on her face. I could tell she was already imagining how she'd set up our room once I was gone. The summer at home felt like living with ghosts. I went to work at the cafe, came home, and handed over half my paycheck to my parents. They accepted the money without a word of thanks. Conversations were limited to the bare necessities, bills or dinner plans. Every time I placed the money on the table, I felt a pang in my chest. It wasn't just money. It was a symbol of my will, my struggle for freedom. Yet it was taken for granted, as though it was simply my duty to give it. I hid in my room, burying myself in books and dreaming desperately of the start of the school year. My only light at the end of the tunnel was the day I would board the bus to Riverside and leave this house, this tension, these stifling walls behind. When August came, I packed my things. No tearful goodbyes, no photos on the porch to mark the occasion. Dad silently helped load my 2 suitcases into the car. Sarah glanced at me briefly from over her phone, her expression indifferent. Well, Mom muttered, not looking up from the dishes when I told her I was leaving. I was about to head to the grocery store. Dad just rustled his newspaper, not even sparing me a glance. There were no hugs, no words of encouragement, not even a fake, "We'll miss you." It felt as if I was leaving for a few days, not forever. The 4-hour bus ride to Riverside felt like a breath of fresh air. With every mile, I could feel the weight lifting from my shoulders. The road was bumpy, but I hardly noticed as I stared out the window, watching the hills and small towns blur past, each one promising freedom. My dorm room was small but cozy. White walls, a narrow desk by the window, and a bed with a thin mattress. It all felt like luxury to me. It was mine. Jenny, my roommate, made an immediate impression on me. She was friendly, energetic, and, most importantly, she cared about how my day went, what I thought, and how I felt. She became the sister I had always wished for. I threw myself into my studies wholeheartedly. Finance, it sounded like the language I wanted to speak. Investment strategies, market analysis, capital management, all of it was like an intricate puzzle that fascinated me. I spent hours in the library, poring over charts and numbers, and my professors praised my dedication and hard work. This time, no one could take credit for my achievements. My success was mine alone. Calls home were rare and followed the same pattern. Mom would talk about how Sarah was thinking of becoming a model. She never asked how I was doing. Her tone was flat, as if she were simply waiting for the opportunity to steer the conversation back to the usual topic. We told her not to rush, Mom explained. She's exploring her options. What is she doing now? I asked one day. She's just looking for something that suits her, Mom replied casually. We don't want her doing anything she doesn't like. I almost laughed at the irony. No one had ever given me that choice. At 16, I had worked myself to exhaustion, giving half my paycheck to parents who didn't thank me but simply took it as their due. But now, for Sarah, there was no pressure at all. When I graduated college with honors, Jenny's family threw me a small celebration. They congratulated me as if I were their own daughter. My parents didn't even bother to show up. 2 weeks later, I returned to my hometown to start working as a junior financial analyst at Reynolds and Associates. My first paycheck was more than my parents had ever earned together. With that money, I was finally able to afford my own apartment. It was small, but it was mine. The peace didn't last long. As soon as word of my new job spread, I received an invitation to dinner. You're doing so well, Dad remarked, eyeing my professional attire across the table. We're so proud of you, Mom added, her tone just a bit too rehearsed. And then came the usual story about Sarah's latest attempts to find herself. Her interviews, modeling auditions, and ideas that never quite materialized. Sarah sat across from me, glued to her phone, as though nothing happening at the table had anything to do with her. She was 19 and had never worked a day in her life. She didn't feel shame or the need to explain herself. Her life carried on in the same carefree routine it always had. I looked at her from across the table, trying to understand how it had all turned out this way. Why was everything always so easy for her? Why was she allowed to choose, while I had been denied that privilege? But one thing was clear, I was no longer a part of their game. Now, I was the one they looked to with expectation in their eyes, as if I were their salvation. The hints grew subtler, almost imperceptible, but no less heavy. Mom sighed over rising property taxes, and Dad would drawl, "It's tough to make ends meet these days." I started giving them money. At first, it was $500 here, $1,000 there, something to help with bills or home repairs. But the more I gave, the more they seemed to expect. I felt how every gesture of generosity turned into an obligation, and every bit of help became a silent acknowledgement that I owed them, for leaving, for choosing to build a life separate from theirs. The day I was promoted to senior financial analyst wasn't just a triumph, it was also the moment I made a mistake. I told Mom about it during our weekly phone call. Her voice suddenly sounded unusually enthusiastic. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart. You're amazing. Let's have a dinner to celebrate." At the dinner, everything started the way it usually did, smiles, vague compliments, and talk about how great it was that I was doing so well. But soon, Mom's tone shifted. "You know, your dad was saying that his hours got cut at work again," she sighed. "And the utility bills this month are just awful." As she spoke, she pulled a crumpled piece of paper out of her pocket. Her eyes were already glistening, as though anticipating sympathy. Dad nodded, adding, "Everything's getting more expensive. We're not sure how we'll manage." I glanced at Sarah, sitting across from me. She was absorbed in her phone, dressed in designer jeans I knew my parents couldn't afford. Her indifference was almost deafening. "What about Sarah?" The words escaped my lips before I could stop them. "She's exploring her options," Mom replied calmly, as if excusing her. "We don't want to pressure her." The words caught in my throat. How could she spend hours filming dance videos for social media but not find the time to fill out a single job application? But I swallowed my anger. And then Mom dropped the bombshell. "You know, Lucinda, we've been thinking, you spend so much on your apartment. Why not move back home? It would save you money, and we could help each other out." Those words triggered a strange sense of déjà vu. I felt like I was 16 again, handing over my paycheck to the bottomless family jar. The thought of returning to that house, losing my independence, my space, it made my stomach twist painfully. "All right," I heard myself say before I could think. The joy on their faces was almost blinding. A week later, I moved back into my childhood bedroom. It felt smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had just outgrown it. I quickly laid down some ground rules. I'd help with bills and groceries, but I wouldn't be cooking or cleaning. I'd done enough of that as a child. Mom agreed so quickly it made me suspicious. It wasn't until the next day that I understood why. "What do you mean, I have to clean?" Sarah's voice echoed through the house, shrill and indignant. "I don't even know how to use a vacuum cleaner." I peeked out of my room to see the scene unfolding. Mom was speaking softly, almost apologetically. "It's time you learned, Sarah. Lucinda is helping us financially, so you could take on some of the housework." Sarah stomped around the house, dragging the vacuum cleaner behind her, loudly complaining the entire time. She pushed the nozzle across the carpet with such disdain it seemed like she might throw it down at any moment. Her muttering about the unfairness of life didn't stop for a second. I went back to my room, shutting the door behind me to drown out Sarah's complaints. But even behind the closed door, I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped all over again. Later, Sarah posted passive-aggressive Instagram stories about forced labor and unfair treatment, accompanied by pictures of the vacuum cleaner and sarcastic captions. I couldn't bring myself to care. After all, she was still living off my money. Groceries, utilities, and even what amounted to rent, all of it was paid by me. Whatever my parents said about financial struggles, they never seemed to get any lighter, even with my regular contributions. The least Sarah could do was learn to clean the bathroom. "Lucinda, have you noticed how shabby the house looks?" Mom asked one morning over coffee. I glanced up from my phone. "The paint is peeling, and the wallpaper in the living room isn't what it used to be," she continued, as if it were just an innocent observation. Dad chimed in immediately. "And the plumbing in the bathroom is outdated. It'd be nice to do some renovations." 3 days later, they outright asked me to help with home improvements. Of course, by help, they meant footing the bill. In the end, I spent around $30,000 on renovations and remodeling. I had the entire house repainted, replaced the plumbing, updated the kitchen appliances, installed hardwood floors to replace the old carpeting, and hung new wallpaper in every room. The house's facade was refreshed, and the garden landscaped. The house was transformed, and I had to admit, it looked like something out of a home renovation magazine. And just like that, our house became the center of family life. "You have to come and see what we've done with the place," Mom said over the phone to relatives and friends. "We made such wonderful improvements. It's what we've always dreamed of," she added proudly. At family gatherings, I sat silently in the corner, watching as Mom and Dad accepted compliments for their excellent taste. Not once did they mention that I had paid for the entire renovation. Not once did they acknowledge that their upgraded lifestyle was only possible because of my bank account. As Christmas approached, they planned the biggest celebration they'd ever hosted. Mom invited every relative within driving distance and half of her friends. "Everyone will see how well we're doing," she kept saying, brimming with excitement. I spent a small fortune on gifts for everyone. For Sarah, who had been hinting for weeks, I bought a new laptop. On Christmas Day, the house was packed with people marveling at the renovations and enjoying the food I had, of course, also paid for. When it was time to exchange gifts, I sat in the corner of the room, watching as everyone unwrapped their presents. Sarah opened her box to find a brand new iPhone and screamed so loudly with excitement that the neighbors probably heard her. The phone, complete with all the accessories, was a gift from our parents. "Thank you. This is the best gift ever," she shouted, hugging them. My gift was far more modest, a bath set from a pharmacy, clearly bought at the last minute. I said nothing, just smiled and thanked them. I watched as everyone reveled in the expensive gifts I had bought them, only to see the gratitude directed toward my parents. No one seemed to notice the obvious discrepancy. No one cared who had actually paid for it all. As the evening drew to a close, Mom cleared her throat to get everyone's attention. "I have an announcement," she began, looking at her friend Linda, who had traveled from another state. "Linda and her kids will be staying with us for a few days." I froze. More people. More expenses. Another reminder that my contributions were just their convenience. Linda smiled warmly, and her 2 teenagers looked tired from the long trip. "That's nice," I said, trying to keep my tone even. In my mind, I was already picturing how cramped the living room would be with 3 people sleeping there. But Mom wasn't done. "Lucinda, you'll need to clear out your room," she said casually. "Linda and the kids will be staying there." I froze. In the living room, lit with Christmas lights and filled with the sounds of holiday chatter, Mom's words landed with a chilling weight. Linda and her kids shifted awkwardly, clearly sensing the tension. "They can stay in the living room," I suggested, trying to stay calm. "We have a pull-out couch and an air mattress." "That's ridiculous," Mom snapped. "They're guests. We can't have them sleeping in the living room. It would be uncomfortable for them." The irony of her words hit me like a slap. She cared about their comfort, but mine, apparently, didn't matter. "And what about my comfort?" I asked, feeling my cheeks flush with heat. "Have you ever thought about that?" Dad waved a dismissive hand, clearly annoyed. "Stop making a scene, Lucinda. Just pack your things and move to the living room. It's only for a few days." I looked around. At the house I had renovated. At the Christmas decorations I had paid for. At the gifts I had bought. Something inside me snapped. "Why can't they stay in Sarah's room?" I said. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's head snapped up from her new iPhone, her face twisted with outrage. "That's absolutely out of the question," she exclaimed. Mom and Dad exchanged glances, as if I had suggested something unthinkable. "I can't believe you'd even suggest that," Sarah muttered, her voice trembling with indignation. "Why?" I pressed. "Why is it okay to displace me but not her?" Mom's face turned red with anger. "You're embarrassing us in front of our friends," she hissed. "We didn't raise you to behave like this." "If you can't show proper respect," Dad boomed, "then maybe you shouldn't be here at all." "Get out," Mom screeched. "Get out until you learn some manners." I looked at all of them. At Mom's self-righteous, angry face. At Dad, flushed with fury. At Sarah's smug smirk. None of them seemed to remember, or care, that I was the one paying for the roof over their heads, the food on their table, the gifts under their tree. I didn't remind them. Instead, I walked upstairs to my room, the room they were so willing to give away, as if it were theirs to give. My hands were steady as I packed my suitcase. Then I called around to find a hotel or hostel with available rooms. A small hostel on the edge of town had one room left. I booked it immediately. 20 minutes later, I descended the beautiful wooden stairs I had once paid for, carrying my suitcase. No one tried to stop me. No one said a word. Sarah just smirked and continued fiddling with her new iPhone. The hostel was small, and the room was tiny, with a sagging bed and a shared bathroom down the hall. But even there, I felt more at home than I had in my parents' house in years. I spent New Year's Eve alone. With Chinese takeout, my laptop, and a search for apartments. I found a one-bedroom in a modern complex on the other side of town, far from the neighborhood where my parents lived. The place immediately felt right, bright, spacious, with large windows overlooking a park. I knew it would be my new home. In the following days, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. My parents and Sarah kept calling and texting, but I ignored them. I didn't even read their messages, simply turning off notifications. I bought furniture that I genuinely liked, not what my parents would have approved of. I painted the walls in soft pastel tones of my own choosing, without anyone's input. I hung up artwork and photos that brought me joy. For the first time, I created a space that was entirely mine. 2 weeks later, I moved in. My phone went silent as I settled into my new home. But one day it rang, and without checking the number, I answered out of habit. "It's time to pay the utility bills," Mom said. No greeting, no apology. Her voice was sharp and demanding. "Linda and her kids have left, so you can come back now. Your room is waiting." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "No," I said, my voice calm. "What do you mean?" Mom asked, genuine confusion in her tone. It was as if the possibility of me refusing had never occurred to her. "I mean no, Mom. I'm not coming back, and I'm not paying your bills anymore." There was silence. And then an explosion. "How dare you," she yelled. "After everything we've done for you. This is how you repay us. You're abandoning your family when we need you." I stayed silent, letting her rant. None of her accusations, none of her attempts to guilt me, touched me anymore. "You've made it very clear that to you, I'm nothing more than a checkbook," I said when she finally paused for breath. "Well, this checkbook is closed. Don't call me again unless you're ready to treat me with respect." I hung up before she could respond. The calls and messages intensified. My father left voicemails about family duty. Sarah sent manipulative texts, complaining about how much she was suffering because of my selfishness. My mother swung between anger and tears, using anything she could to try to make me change my mind. I blocked them all. Weeks passed, then months. I threw myself into work, earned another promotion, started taking yoga classes, and made new friends. Through them, I occasionally heard about what was going on at my parents' house. They were struggling to pay their bills. Sarah had gotten a job as a cashier at the local supermarket, the same job she had always looked down on. But she hated it, calling in sick and complaining about having to stand all day. My mom and dad told anyone who would listen how their ungrateful eldest daughter abandoned them in their time of need. They wove elaborate tales about the sacrifices they had made for my education, how they had supported my career, which they never did, and how I had betrayed them as soon as I became successful. Some people believed them. Let them. The truth was, I had spent 25 years trying to be the person they wanted me to be, the obedient daughter, the family ATM. Now, it was time to be myself. The irony was, I was grateful to them. But not for the years of manipulation and control, no, I was grateful for that final Christmas night when they pushed too far. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find yourself.